The Maumau's bush skills were little help outside the forests. Armed with nothing but homemade guns and panga knives, they were a weak enemy compared to the troops mobilized against them. But still, the British military responded with the full force of a colonial power. The forests were bombed and became the main hunting ground for Maumau. The forests and a 1-mile strip around them were declared prohibited areas. Any African living nearby was in danger.
When we saw an African in the forest or within the 1-mile strip outside the edge of the forest, we were instructed to treat this African as a Maumau. And so it was, shoot on sight is a fair way of describing it.
Nobody knew how many Kikuyu had taken the Maumau oath. To most soldiers and police, all Kikuyu were potential enemies.
You get these young soldiers coming in, they're pitch-poled into a situation where there's a mass of black people. They cannot differentiate between one black man and another. They don't even see the skin colours. They can't tell one tribe from another. The officers are trained for battle situations when you go forth with your platoon or your company and you do something. Well, there's precious little for them to do, precious little for them to attack, and soldiers get bored.
Without knowing who was the enemy and who was not, some soldiers and police began taking the law into their own hands. Reports of brutality by the security forces began to appear in the British press. One newspaper carried a story describing a gruesome method by which British troops kept a record of their Maumau kills.
Na makauraga ndu muno njoni mauka mamwithira nakwa ni kumutituri makamuraga makamurenga njara makathina njara ici ikinyithitwe figures ikinyithitwe irore
ni twacoka thikauti kumenya uria bekarire tugakoreria ni ng'ania wetu urathirwe na arengwa njara riu ucio tutiatindanagira nake no cio tungikoreria murage ata murenge njara ni twamenyaga mundu ucio timuone ni andu acio tukamwoca tukamwitha rungu rwa miti.
A year into the emergency, more shocking stories about troop brutality began to surface. In November 1953, Captain Gerald Griffiths of the King's African Rifles hit the headlines in Britain when, in the course of his court-martial for murdering an African worker, he admitted to paying his men 5 shillings a head for every Maumau they killed. A witness at the trial said he was told by Griffiths he could shoot anybody he liked so long as they were black, because Griffiths wanted to increase his company's score of kills to 50.
Certainly, my own regiment, for example, when we got going, the commanding officer offered a cash prize to the first patrol to kill a Maumau. The same sort of thing had been done in Malaya, and it was of course an incentive.
The practice was written up in the regimental records, and the story soon found its way to the House of Commons and the British press.
I was sent home on a course about halfway through our time in Kenya, and I was at home in Teignmouth in Devon. And about the time I was there was a great headline in the newspaper, "Is your son in the Devons? If so, is he a murderer?" And people who I thought were really good old friends were distinctly chilly with me.
The British military commander-in-chief, General George Erskine, was appalled by what he called the breach of discipline among the forces. He sent round a stern memo, warning them to clean up their act.
I think probably going into the forest and shooting natives of what to an extent was a host country was a little bit offside.
But the real battle against Maumau was not fought in the forests. It was a struggle for hearts and minds. In late 1953, the British began a new campaign to cut the Maumau off from their supporters. In towns and villages, Kikuyu were rounded up by the government and divided into loyal and disloyal. The first target was Nairobi, believed to be the center of Maumau organization. A ruthless operation to clear the city of suspect Kikuyu was put into action. It was called Operation Anvil.
You woke up in the morning and the whole estate was kind of surrounded by soldiers with guns, and people were herded to small areas without knowing what is happening. They were not guilty of anything. They just had to be taken away and removed. Whether you were innocent or not, you had to go.
By the end of Operation Anvil, more than 30,000 Kikuyu had been swept out of the city and sent to holding camps, regardless of their allegiance. This policy punished the entire Kikuyu tribe for the sins of a minority. In the roundups, families were separated. Men were taken to the camps. Women and children were forced onto the overcrowded native reserves. In rural areas, Kikuyu were pushed into specially built fortified villages where they lived under 23-hour curfew. This policy, known as villagization, gave the colonial authorities total control over the tribe. The government portrayed it as purely protective and beneficial for the Africans.
During the emergency, the Kikuyu were concentrated into villages as a protection against Maumau, and quickly recognized the advantages of this organization.
Villagization was anathema to the Kikuyu. The Kikuyu live on farms, they love their land, and to push them into a village was to destroy a whole part of their culture.
The villages were controlled by the Home Guard, local police forces made up of Kikuyu loyal to the British. Divide and rule of the tribe became an effective weapon in the campaign.
To aid them in their struggle, hundreds of loyal Africans, among them men of the Kikuyu tribe, keep constant guard.
As the British government continued its technique of reward and punishment, the Kikuyu tribe was split. Loyalists paid a higher and higher price for their allegiance.
Nikoraga twauragaga na riri na niwe gucaga tukiwe gukirwo ati Maumau ni njuku muno tondu iraruraga mundu igacoka igatura migwanja ikathii igacuria umwe na kwire uria ingi igacuria na kuria.
Gitumi kia mundu ucio wa loyo aitwe twaitaga tumwite ituge tumwite twamwitaga ni undu mundu ucio niwe utarenda wiathi wetu uria turetia tondu twaya nyumuma ati tungikona munyakeru ni kunyonga kwoguo twamaitaga ni undu wa kuthi kumbura thiri tondu ni acoka twamurekereria athi aturetere engi muno mauke akore methera muraia methere wingi uciarive na indo itabwe nyingi muno ucio twaitaga wita uguo twekaga.
The Maumau had earned their reputation for violence, but in the face of such determined rebellion, it was the British who would finally take the brutality one step too far. The gift of civilization had always been invoked to justify rule over the black man. But in wiping the colony clean of Maumau, the British used methods that were anything but civilized. Emergency law was rough justice. It became a capital offense to take a Maumau oath, or even to be seen with anyone carrying a gun. Between 1953 and 1956, more than 1,000 Africans were hanged for alleged Maumau crimes. Public hanging had been outlawed in Britain for over a century, but in Kenya, it was used to keep the rest of the population in line.
When somebody did have to hang for their Maumau crimes, then the British felt that the Kikuyu should not only have justice done to them, but should see that justice was done. There was a mobile gallows. The actual drop was, of course, screened off, but one could see, or at least imagine, the Maumau convict mounting the staircase to the platform, and presumably one could hear the drop. Dead Maumau, particularly Maumau commanders, were displayed at crossroads, at marketplaces, at administrative centres, to demonstrate that if you fought against the British, you could meet a sticky end.
Many more thousands were held in detention camps on suspicion of being Maumau. During the emergency, the camps held more than 80,000. In 1954, 1/3 of all Kikuyu men were said to be in prison at any one time. These detainees had not been convicted of any crime and were held without trial. The government was still obsessed with the power of the Maumau oath. They believed that any Kikuyu still bound by it would be a danger to the stability of the colony. Every prisoner had to denounce the oath and submit to a cleansing ceremony.
A lot of pressure was put on me and other people to confess the oath, which of course we denied. It was very dehumanizing. You were made to feel you were nothing. You're being whipped and kind of walking, you made to run on your knees, literally. You had to crawl until you sweat. Then you were made to stand for sometimes overnight under very heavy light. You had to be pushed and knocked around and frightened in so much that people had even to admit what was not true.
By 1956, the camps held 20,000 detainees who still refused to confess that they had taken an oath. As a fighting force, Maumau had been defeated, but the logjam of suspects meant that the emergency could not be brought to an end. London demanded that some way be found to speed up the process of cleansing detainees of their oaths.
The way that it found was, if you beat them up enough, then they'll confess an oath. So what you do is you beat them up and then you give them a bit of paper and a piece of pencil and say, confess, I took it, I took it, I took it. You are now a human being again.
I think sort of Christianity had been tried and hadn't succeeded with them. And they needed a sort of moral compulsion, I don't know how one else could put it really, to confess their oaths.
The Mwea camps held 5,000 detainees who were refusing to confess the oath and submit to the rehabilitation process.
I was told that I was going to be posted to take over the rehabilitation at the Mwea camps. So I said, no, I don't want to do this. And I was then told, you can't say no in a service, you have to, at the very least, go and look at it. So I went to go and have a look at it. There I met Superintendent Cowan.
John Cowan was head of the Mwea detention camps. He developed an effective method of extracting confessions.
In one of my camps, there was a small faction of Maumau detainees who were difficult, and there was a procedure which was implemented there which was successful. It was a very sort of embryonic procedure. We had to coerce them into confessing. We used a little bit of force on them. They were surrounded by elders and by other detainees, all pleading with them to confess, shouting at them. It's difficult for them to resist. It was pressure, really. And they did confess in the end.
Superintendent Cowan explained to me in great detail what he did. And he told me that my fears were totally groundless because all it was just like a good rugger scrum.
There might have been hand slapping, possibly an odd fist or two here and there, but no more than that. I never saw a man, in all the time I was there, having had force perpetrated on him, in any worse condition than an amateur boxer getting out of a ring.
Cowan's method, using what was called compelling force, proved very successful at eliciting confessions. He was asked to write a report on how to deal with a group of hardcore detainees held at a camp called Hola. Now violence was enshrined as official policy. It was here, at Hola, that the government's brutality would finally bring the crisis to a tragic end. The Hola prisoners refused to confess the oath or to perform manual labor. They declared themselves political prisoners.
No nyitanire na thirikari ya Ngeretha uiruke tukirega tugicokio thiini tondu tutingeiruka tukiregire guthereta ciendaga tondu tutiathiite njera nigetha tukathukume twathiite kuruira wiaci.
The Cowan plan outlined a scheme to make the Hola detainees submit to authority. The first thing was to get them to obey work orders.
Envisaged a possibility that the detainees wouldn't immediately prove amenable to work, and that if they didn't, they should be, in the phrase, manhandled to the site of work and forced to carry out the task. We thought that compelling force might have to be used. We might have to make them.
But they weren't being violent, were they? They were simply refusing
No, they
to
weren't.
work.
They weren't being violent, but they were being very insolent, and their whole demeanour was one of sort of insolence and arrogance, and they weren't. No one was going to do anything with them at all.
On the 3rd of March 1959, the camp commandant put Cowan's plan into action. 85 prisoners were marched out to a site and ordered to work.
Tukitwara hau mugunda-ini ta handu ha makinya hakuhi magana mana kuma kambini tugikora riu kuu kuigitwo thururu na macembe tukirwo riu no nginya twambiririe kuruta wira wa kwenja mitaro. Ithuĩ tukiuga tutingĩenja mitaro tondu ithuĩ turarĩohe nĩ tũrĩkĩtie kĩoho, ningĩ ithuĩ twĩ gũkũ nĩ ũndũ wa wĩyathi tũtiũkĩte gũtuĩka ngombo.
When the prisoners refused peacefully to cooperate, the commandant decided to compel the men to work.
Nĩ ũndũ wa ũguo, kwarĩ na thigari 200, thigari 170 ciarũngiĩ na nja na mĩcinga. Nacio thigari 30 nĩcio ciarĩ thĩinĩ witũ ina njũgũma. Mũthũngũ ũrĩa warĩ kuo akĩhuha birĩri. Nĩ ũndũ wa ũguo ithuĩ twakĩambĩrĩirie kũhũrwo na njũgũma. Tũgĩkĩhũrwo kĩwanja gĩothe wakĩona kĩu kĩa Hola, no rũkũngũ rũtheri rũrombũka. Twahũrirwo kuma thaa icio 2 nginya thaa 5:30. Rĩu mũgakĩhũragwo na thimbu, tondũ mũthigari ekũgucia rĩu mũndũ ũmwe kana erĩ agatwara harĩa ku. No niĩ nĩ ũndũ wa mũnyaka ndatigirwo magũrũ nja na moko, kũu nĩkuo kwahũrirwo. Nĩ ũndũ arĩa makuire arĩa twariganĩtie nĩo makĩndũgĩrĩria. No arĩa tondũ no bara maragĩka atĩa marakĩrũa, ũguo twahũragwo tũkometio thĩ. Rĩu tondũ ndũkĩrĩ muohe, wakĩgarũrwo ũkahũrwo na gũkũ, wegarũrwo ũkahũrwo na gũkũ.
When the guards stopped, 11 men lay dead and 60 were seriously injured. The district commissioner was called to the scene.
So I go up to Hola, where as far as I could see, there were quite a number of corpses on the ground. And a lot of others injured, writhing about, and a whole gaggle of people, black prison officers, prison warders, and white prison officers standing around, all not knowing what to do. I realized at once that this was political dynamite.
Prison officers claimed the detainees had died drinking contaminated water from a tank. The story found its way back to London. The Labour MP Barbara Castle had been monitoring reports of British brutality throughout the Maumau crisis. She was sceptical when she read the first reports of Hola.
A story appeared in the press that 11 Africans had died. But the explanation given by the Europeans in control of the camp was they died drinking water from a water cart. Well, I mean, I could guess that another cover-up was taking place, but I felt pretty helpless.
But the true story of the prisoners' deaths could not be kept quiet.
The corpses had to be got rid of. We had to fly them out in a plane from our dirt airstrip. They had to be flown to Malindi, which was the nearest place where, again, it's all publicity, you see. The news had got out. Corpses were being flown in from Hola where they'd been beaten up.
An incident that had appalled people on the ground caused an uproar in Britain. The Cowan Plan, with its instructions to manhandle the prisoners, came under fire.
I didn't feel guilty, I don't think. I don't think that's quite the word. I felt obviously very sorry indeed and great regret that 11 men had died and 60-odd had been injured. I'm sorry that I didn't modify that particular phrase that I used, but I didn't. I think that was couldn't have been foreseen. I didn't feel guilty that the procedure had gone wrong. I felt extremely sorry that it had gone wrong, but not actually guilty.
For the first time, the full horror of what had been happening in Kenya was revealed to a shocked public. Suddenly it was the British authorities who looked like brutal thugs. In the House of Commons, the scandal brought condemnation from all sides.
I went into the House. I was so trembling with rage. I could barely get the words out. It was a packed House of Commons. And I was followed immediately by Enoch Powell in his very clipped, upright, business-like tones, with no emotion in it, but also tearing the cover-up case apart brilliantly.
Facing political disaster, the Tories rushed to repair the damage. Within weeks, London stopped the rehabilitation process in the Kenyan camps. The Maumau oath, which had dominated the crisis, suddenly became irrelevant.
Everyone was pushed out as fast as possible, whether they'd confessed to taking an oath or not confessed to taking an oath, whether they were still human or subhuman or not human or whatever. And the move to independence via the release of Kenyatta, the leader of the Kikuyu and the leader of the movement, began to go more and more quickly.
The scandal of Hola highlighted the Africans' political aspirations, but it also revealed the hypocrisy of a colonial power that tried to civilize its African subjects with brutality.
They weren't animals, they weren't this, that and the other. What they were doing was fighting a political fight for their freedom, and Hola eventually gave it to them.
The emergency that had cost the lives of 32 settlers and 11,500 Maumau was over. For Britain, Hola brought the Maumau crisis and her romance with Kenya to a shameful end.
It's hard to believe that that could have happened under a British colonial administration, but it did. And it followed us. It was in a period of insensitivity to the fact that these Africans were human beings that were going to develop and demand the right to develop and to rule themselves.
In 1963, only 4 years after the Hola massacre, Kenya was granted independence. Jomo Kenyatta, freed from prison, became the country's first president. The men and women who had been cast as savages were free to run their own country. Joining the celebrations were the last die-hard Maumau, who had always vowed to stay in the forests until